We are now on the bottom of Daf Ayin Gimel Amid Aleph, and we're up to Esvei, 2 lines before the end of Ayin Gimel Amid Aleph. And just by way of summarizing what we have until this point, so we can move further, we have Rav Huna in the name of Rav, and that means that you don't need an Akira if you have a Karban Asham. You could be makir as an ola in event that the Karban Asham no longer serves its purpose. And the conclusion that we derive from this statement of Rav is that in a case of a Pesach, if let's say the Pesach was, as was turned out, it was without Bailim, without Ochlim, again, we didn't know that at the time of the Shechita, then the Shechita now is a Shechita of Shlomim. Just like the Asham, according to Rab, becomes an Ola in a case where it no longer can serve its function as an Asham, so too, according to Rab, a Karban Pesach that cannot serve as its function, there are no Ochlim, will now be redirected automatically without even an Akira as a Karban Shlom. Esvei Rav Chizdel Rav Huna, we have a Mishnah that says Chato if he shechts the Karban Pesach on Shabbos, Vinoda Shemashcho, Mashchu Bailam Es Yoda, or Nitmu, or Mesu, all those. Now we turn to Daf Ayin Gimel and Beis. V'tani Allah, the Brisa embellishes that Mishnah and says, B'chol, if such a thing happens, and the 14th of Nisan, every Pesach is on Chol on a weekday, Ki Hai Gavna, Yisaref Miyad. If we find out after the Shechita, that before the Shechita already there were no Bailim on this carbon, or they would tmeim and the carbon is possible. Now what we could do is we could burn the carbon immediately. Now, what's the big chiddush here that on a chol, on a weekday, we could burn the carbon immediately? That's obvious, no? No, it's not obvious at all. Because this carbon, at the time of the Shechita, was assumed to be Ro'i l'Shechita as a hakrav. So they were magdish the animal. Originally, they were menuyim on this Karban Pesach. Everything was done kedasu kedin, and only some irua happened later, and the Bailim died. Never, or they decided to find a different Karban Pesach. They didn't like Mary's lamb. They wanted to get a different lamb. So in such a case, if we assume, like Rav, that lo be'inan akira, that since the Bailim are no longer around and it's not L'Shem Ochlim and the carbon can no longer serve a function as Karban Pesach, it automatically becomes redirected and established as a Karban Shlomim, then we would not apply the principle of Sreifa Miyat. We would require what we call Ibud Tsura. And again, that's something we'd have to write on the whiteboard, but you'll see it right here in the Gemara, so you can just underline it in your Gemara, which means we have to wait until after the carbon has passed its allotted time. You can no longer eat the carbon. And that's called a psulina. And now that it's possible lina, we can burn the carbon. We need that extra psul because the carbon has a status of hegdesh if you assume, like Rav, lo boyakira. So the Gemara asks, Rav Chizda asks Rav Huna, if you're going to tell me that carbon, even though it can no longer serve as a Karban Pesach, you have to redirect it and do it shchita l'shem shlomim, is high in this case of a Karban Pesach, where the shochet, the Kohen HaShochet, had no clue that this was a Karban Shlomim, and to make an Akira and decide I am shechting this as a Shlomim, he shechted it l'shem Pesach. And lo and behold, he finds out that there were no Bailim on this carbon. Is Pesachu. Now it has a shame Pesach, and it's possible. Why? Because came under Leslu Bailim, Havile Psul Begufa. It's a Psul in the Gufa carbon. It's Amtulach Yisarf Minat. If you have a carbon that's possible and it's Chol, nothing should stop you. You burn it immediately. But according to you, Rav Huna, the way you transmit the ruling of Rav, that lo bayakira, which means that this carbon that can no longer serve in its original function as a Pesach because it's got no Bailim and no Ochlim, therefore gets redirected as a shlomim. Automatically, you don't need an akira. So then, may resha havi le shlomim. In other words, even before he shechted the animal, the shame zevach on this behema is shlomim, because Rav holds lo boy akira, and the very moment that the Bailam died, or they found themselves at other Pesach, there's no minui, no menuyim, it automatically can no longer be a Korban Pesach, but it gets redirected as a shlomim according to Rav. Upsula mishumai. Oh, now let's ask the following question. It's Erev Pesach, and according to Rav, this carbon is a carbon shlomim, and I couldn't care less whether he has in mind for a carbon shlomim or mistakenly thinks it's a Pesach. It's irrelevant because the carbon can no longer be a Pesach, and it becomes a shlomim. So what's the psul? Mishum davar achin. There's an external psul. It's not begufo. The gufa carbon is kosher as a shlomim, and he shechted it properly. But the kashochet le achar tomid shel bein arbaim. Now we go back to what we learned in Peret Tomid Nishchat, and you recall that the carbon tomid shel bein arbaim has to be a leo hashlim is called a carbon skulam, and you're not allowed to bring another carbon except for a carbon pesach after the carbon tomid shel bein arbaim. This carbon is no longer carbon pesach. According to Rav, it's a carbon shlomim, and he shechted it after the tomid shel bein arbaim in the afternoon of the 14th. If that be the case, then what do we have? We have a psul mishum davar acher. It's not a psul begufo. It's an extraneous psul. It's a psul because it undermines the status of the carbon tomid. In such a case, you don't burn that kind of carbon. It really has inherent kedusha. It would be a bizayon to kudshim to burn it. But Ella, what do we do with it? Ibur tzura. That's those two words I wanted you to underline. Boy, we need ibur tzura. We have to wait until it loses, if you translate this literally, it's tzuras bas of a carbon, which means that we wait until a day or two pass and it no longer is roy. Desanya zakal kol shepsul begufo yisarf miyad. But bedam ubebailim to ubar tzuraso, and then yetze lebeis hasur. So in the case of a psul begufo, for example, let's say I'll give you an example. A kohen would have machshavas pigul of chutzlas mano, or let's say, for example, the carbon became tameh or nosar, or it was taken out, the psul yotze out of the mechitza of the azara. In all these cases, or for example, in the case of a pesach, he shechted shalol nuya. In all these cases, it's a psul begufa, and the Bryce establishes yitzarf miyah. However, if it's a psul bedam, let's say, for example, he shechs the carbon pesach, and he wasn't able to catch the dam as it came out of the tzara behema before it hit the ritzvah of the azara. So there was never a kabbalah in a klisharis. The kohen picks up the dam, collects it in a klisharis from the ground for the ritzvah of the azara. That's a psul because there was no kabbalah sadam in a klisharis. Okay, that's called a psul bachut. In other words, there's nothing in the gufa shel carbon that's possible. It's just that now we don't have a possibility of zrika in dam that fell on the ritzvah before kabbalah and a klisharetz ube bailim. Or for example, there was a psul in the bailiak carbon. For example, after the carbon pesach was shechted it and they was zorik the dam, and now the bailim contract tumor, they die. In all these cases, it's not a psul in the gufa carbon, and that's not such a chomer dik psul. And we're not going to burn it immediately. That would be, as we said before, bizayin to kachim, but rather to bar tzura. And we have to wait until the next day, and it no longer has a tzuras basar carbon, it's nosar, and that's not and now once it becomes nosar, then it's a psul begufo, and then we could go out and burn it. Now, according to what we said in this brisa, the carbon that's possible is yisarf miyad, only in a case of psul begufo. So you see from this Tana in the brisa, who says that a carbon pesach and it was shechted b'chol, and we find out that lo and behold there were no bailim on the carbon, machli yedeyim or mesu, is yisarf miyad. It must be that this brisa holds that you need an akira. in order to set it up as a korban shlamim, you have to announce and declare that I am shechting it as a korban shlamim. In this case, he shechted it unbeknown to him that it couldn't serve as a Pesach because machlu bailam, etc. He shechted it l'shem Pesach, and it was a Pesach shenichkat shelo li'ochlim or shelo limnuyim. That's called a psul begufa. That makes sense, and therefore you sarf miyad. But according to Rav, who holds that in the case of a korban asham, even if he shechted it stam, if mesu bailav, etc., it's kosher as a korban ola, which means that a korban doesn't need an akira. And in this case of a Pesach, where there are no ochlim, there are no bailim, etc., the korban can no longer serve its original function for which it was created. It therefore, even without an akira, according to Rav, becomes redirected as a korban shlamim, and he shechted a korban shlamim. What's the problem? The problem is the halach of hashlama, meaning he undermines the Talmud Shel Ben Abayim. That's not a psul begufo, and therefore, how could it be sarif miyad? It should be that we have to wait for the covet of this kachim till after it becomes nosar. Ella, the Gemara now retracts its position, and really, Rav holds that you need an akir. And if you designate a korban as an asham, you cannot be makriv that asham as an ola, even in the case of Mesu Bailav, etc., unless he was oker the shame asham. Lo tema, we go back to rewrite the script of the transmission of Rav Huda in the name of Rav. In the case of asham, shenitak l'raya, and then we're going to read it as shchato stam. We cannot read it. In other words, lo teva means put an X over the word shchato stam, kosher mishum l'shum ola. That couldn't be the text, because that would imply stam, as we mentioned before, that lo be'inan akira. Ela emo, you have to rewrite the text, a new girsa in the words of Rab, shchato l'shum ola. He made a definite declaration, I'm shechting this korban as an ola. He's okay the shem asham, kosher, and then the korban is kosher. Alma boy akir. The Gemara summarizes that according to Rav now, in this reformulation of the text of Rav, you need an akira. Now, according to the understanding of the Gemara, of this Tana, the Brisa, up until this point at least, we have come to the conclusion that you need an akira, and therefore korban Pesach that was shechted, and we didn't know that there was no bailim, the korban is possible, and he wasn't oker shem Pesach because he had no clue that it could not serve as a Pesach. In such a case, it's a psul begufo, and there was no akira, and therefore yisarif miyah. Now the Gemara wants to present a different shita amongst the Chachamim who would hold ein tzarich akira, which means to really show that there are Tanoim that maintained our original understanding of Rav, which is ein tzarich akira, and you can be makar a korban and redirect it even if you were not oker the original shem. And then we're going to have to figure out when do we apply the principle in the Brisa of Yisarif Miyah. Okay. Now, we had a Mishnah back on Daf Samach Gimel. Somebody shechted a korban Pesach during the days of the Moed, and he had chametz in his possession, according to Reb Shimon. If he shechted it l'shem Pesach, which means it's a korban pasul, then he's not going to be in violation of the law of possessing chametz l'sichal chametz kam zivchi, because this is a Pesach Shalom Bizmano during the Moed, and therefore the Shechita L'Shem Pesach is a Shechita Sheina Re'uya. It's not a valid Shechita, therefore the ownership of Chametz at that time is not going to incur the violation. If he shechted it L'Shem Shlomim, then he violates the law of owning Chametz, according to Reb Shimon, because Reb Shimon understands that Lo Sishchad al Chametz applies not only to Shchitas HaPesach, but even to a shchita of shlomim, and he owned Pesach at that time. It's a shchita re'uya, and therefore he's chayav for violating the law of lo sishcha. Now the Gemara back on Daf Samach Dalid was medayik from the language of the Mishnah that if he shechted it b'moed, it was during the course of Pesach, and he shechted it stam without any machshava whatsoever, he's potter. In other words, the korban is not considered shlomim. It's considered a korban Pesach. And to shech the korban Pesach during the moed is not a valid shechita, obviously, and therefore he doesn't incur a violation of ownership of chametz, and therefore he's potter. And the Gemara now wants to derive from this that you need an akira. Therefore, korban Pesach b'moed, or for that matter, any time during the year except for the Yudalit in the afternoon, if he shechted it and he didn't have an akira in mind, l'shev shlomim, it becomes it doesn't become shlomim automatically if he didn't do the akira, and it still has a shame Pesach, and that's why if he owns chametz, he's potter. And now the Gemara tells us about Rabbi Chia Bar Gamda, who quotes a Chabur of Chachamim. And Rabbi Chia Bar Gamda, they, and we had quoted them back on Daf Samach Daled, they said that you cannot prove from the Mishnah that a korban Pesach that was shechted shelo b'zmano needs akira, because it's possible that that case that was addressed by the Mishnah is a very unique case. Kagon shahayu bailim tmei mason v'nidachil Pesach sheni. What happened was that after the bailim designated a korban or a Pesach, and now they became tmeim, so the Torah says in Parashas Baloscha that they will take that same identical korban and they will bring it a month later in Pesach Sheni. So if you're asking me, says Rav Chia, why this korban does not become a shlomim, even if I hold lo boy akira, the answer is because it's still a korban Pesach. Albeit I won't take it today, I'll take it a month from now and shech it as a korban Pesach. So the Gemara is medayik now from Rabbi Chia. Hi, this korban of this unique case where the bailim contracted tumah and shechted the korban on the moed, who the boy akira? Such a case needs an akira. He has to say this is no longer a korban Pesach; it's a shlomim. Why? Because it remains a korban Pesach until there's an akira, because it's roiv for Pesach Sheni. Habi Alma, but in general, lo boy akira. Is Michael and Meimar? How are we going to explain, according to Chia Bar Gamda, the opinion of the Tan and the Brisa that said that a korban Pesach that was shechted on a weekday, and they found out that there was no bailim, mesu bailim, etc., yisarif miyad. You're telling me, according to Chia Bar Gamda, in the name of this whole chabura, that you need an akira. I'm sorry, that you do not need an akira, according to Rav Chia Bar Gamda, and automatically me'ela of the korban becomes a korban shlomim, which means that it's not a psul b'guf. As we said over and over again, it's a problem of hashlama, and therefore, ye aber tsurasam. We're not going to burn it immediately because it has a shem shlomim. We have to wait till a moon falls, or wait till after it becomes nosar, and then it becomes possible gufo, and only then do we burn the korban. Ella Amar Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yoshua. Now we're going back to the original position as we understood Rav, and as Rav Huna quoted Rav, that lo boy akira, just like in the case of Asham, it becomes an olaf mesu bailim. So too in the case of a korban Pesach, there are no bailim, there are no ochlim, it becomes automatically a korban shlomim. And now we can go back to the original girsa that we had originally of shchato stam, and it's kosher as a korban ola, even though he was makdish originally as a korban asham. He doesn't need an akira; it becomes automatically an ola. And forget about changing the girsa. V'hacha The brisa that says during the weekday, if the Pesach turns out to be a Pesach below Bailim, because the Bailim were Mochlim Yedeim or they died, is he Sarif Miyad? Oh, no. This has nothing to do with the fact that there was a lack of an Akira. But for my Askina, what's the case? Kigon, if Rishu Kodem Chatzos, Umesu Bailim Achar Chatzos. At the time that he was mafresh this lamb as a korban Pesach, it was Erev Pesach before Chatzos, which means that when the clock struck Chatzos, this korban was roy. It was what's called nira. Nira means it's suitable as a korban. But when did the Bailim die and therefore undermine the korban? That's after Chatzos. Havilei nira v'nidcha. At one point in time, it was nira, it was a valid korban pesach. It was roy lakrov. Then it was nidcha. And now, when we get to Chatzos Hayom, and the Bailim are alive and well, it's roy. Now we get to the Shechita, which was an hour after Chatzos, and the Bailim died, and it's no longer royal akrov, and that's called dichlu. Now we have a principle with regard to dichlu, something that was nira and nidcha. The kol nira v'nidcha shuvein chosav v'nira. Once dichlu is chal, and it's rejected from the mizbeach because the Bailim died at that moment, it's completely excluded. And that's why the Tana of the Brisa says Yisarif miyad if it wasn't Shabbos, correct? Because once it's dichli min hamzbeach, it's completely rejected l'gamrei, and it could never be brought even for shlomim once there's nira v'nidcha. And the mela dino Yisarif miyad. The Gemara doesn't accept this. Midehu taima. Rav Huna never explained that the reason why it's Yisarif miyad is because of dichli. Ella, he only tried to explain the brisa of Yisarif miyad. Why does the brisa say Yisarif miyad? So the answer is because the case of Nira v'nidcha, right? He died after he was mafresh the korban before Chatzos, he died after Chatzos, etc. Now Rav holds that a korban lo tzarech akira. Ha'amar Rav, you want to explain Rav based on what Rav Huna said, but again, Rav Huna only said it to try to justify the brisa. It makes sense out of the fact of Yisarif miyad. But Rav himself, you're not going to be able to use this logic because Rav happens to hold a Bali Chaim Einam Nidachin, that the halacha of Roy v'nidcha means Roy after the Shechita. But if it's a live animal, that's not called Roy, and therefore there's no dichut. And if later on it becomes nidcha, then it goes back to its original kashrus, and it becomes Roy lakrova, and it's kosher l'mizbeach. So again, we're back now to the original contradiction. We don't have this possible answer because it's not going to work out for Rav, because Rav holds that alichaim einam nidachim. So therefore, the korban pesach, in a case where the Bailim pulled out of the korban or they died, and it's no longer a korban pesach, there's no dichui min hamizbeach, so that in the brisa, in the case of Bailim, shemashchu yodam or mesu or nitmu lachar chatzos, and according to Rav Shita, it doesn't need an akira, it becomes automatically a shlomim, and it's not nidche. So at the time of the Shitas HaPesach, it wasn't Dochim min HaMizbeach, because again, Bali Chaim is not Nidachim, so that Krava should be kosher. And again, why does the time of the Brisa say Yisarif miyad? Elomar Rav Papa, now we have to come up with an alternative answer. We can't rely on Rav Huda's answer because it doesn't stem with Rav. So Rav holds Ein Tzarech Akira. And in the case of this Pesach of Bailim, Moshku Yedeim or Mesu or Nitmu, etc., it's now Omed LeKarban Shlamim. The Brisa says Yisarif miyad. Mani, this Brisa reflects the Shita Rabbi Eliezer. The Omar Rabbi Eliezer says, and we had it back on Daf Samach Beis Amid Beis, v'chein hashochet, if a person checked a lamb or a kid that was designated acherim for other karbonos, l'shem Pesach, and he shechted it for the purpose of a Pesach, is Rabbi Eliezer holds pasul. In other words, now we can understand the brisa that says that a Pesach that was shechted during the chol is yisarf miyad, ahavile psula begufo. The carbon is pasul begufo. And why is that? Because hol v'nasim of shlamim, he shechted it for the purpose of a Pesach, and the law is that any carbon, for example, a shlamim, that was shechted l'shem Pesach, is pasul. That's the shita of Rabbi Eliezer. So now it becomes a psul haguf and yisarf miyah. So the Gemara asks, "Ve'i Rabbi Eliezer, if this brisa reflects the shita of Rabbi Eliezer, and keep in mind this brisa is explaining our Mishnah, and the brisa said that if he shechts on Shabbos and then he finds out that there were no bailim, that he's potter from a chatos, mipnei sheshachat bershus, meaning he had every reason to assume that this is a carbon kosher. He didn't know that nimtu bailim or mesa bailim, so he shechted it as such, and therefore he doesn't have to bring a carbon chatos. We have a justifiable mistake. He's called Torah b'dvar Mishnah, Torah b'dvar mitzvah, and therefore he's part from a carbon. But wait a second, that makes sense according to Rabbi Yeshua. But now you're introducing the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. It's therefore chatos nami mechayev. Forget about the din of Sreifas Karvan on this case of, let's say, of Pesach Shechal B'chol, but what about a case where he shechted it on Erev Pesach Shechal B'Shabbos? He would have to be Chayiv Karban Chatas, though less like Rabbi Eliezer told B'dvar Mitzvah Potter. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees with Rabbi Yeshua. He rejected that principle, told B'dvar Mitzvah. He holds that even if you were a Torah B'dvar Mitzvah and you did a Mitzvah, nevertheless you still have to bring a Chatas because you violated the Shabbos. So therefore, if he shechts shlamim, and we're assuming now that you don't need an akira, and since mashku baleim esidem, therefore it became a carbon shlamim, and now he shechts it for the purpose of Pesach, and the shchita is a shchita psula, and even though his interest was in being the kayim of mitzvah with this shchita, nevertheless he's going to be chayav a carbon chatos. So now we've proven that the Tana of our Mishnah could not work out and reflect the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore the Brisa, which is coming to explain our Mishnah, could not reflect the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. And now we get back to the question, why did the Tana of the Brisa say that in this case the carbon is Yisarf Miyad when it's not a Psul Begufo? We thought we had a great idea here, Rav Papa, that we can introduce Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that if you shechta a carbon Shalom L'Shem Pesach, it's possible Begufo. Hence, he sarf miyad, but it can't work out because this price is explaining the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is not Rabbi Eliezer because the Mishnah is holding that there's a Torah called Torah b'dvar mitzvah, and Rabbi Eliezer rejects that principle. Ella, says the Gemara, Targama, Rav Yosef Berei, de Rav Salah Hasidic Kami, de Rav Papa, Hamani, this price reflects the Shita of Yosef ben Chonoihi. Isnan, we have Mishnah at the beginning of Zvachim, Yosef ben Chonoi Omer, Hanishchatim, any carbon, from any kind of carbon, that was shechted on Erev Pesach, L'Shem Pesach. In other words, he shechted the carbon during, just 1 second, is Hanishchatim carbon that he shechted it on Erev Pesach, L'Shem Pesach. Okay, so any carbon that you shecht on Erev Pesach, L'Shem Pesach, is possible, and a reverse case. And what's that? L'Shem Chatas. If, let's say, during the course of the year, he shechted a carbon Pesach, L'Shem Chatas, Psulim. Alma, we see clearly from Yosef ben Chaunoi, that Psulo Begufohi. That if you take a carbon shlamim and you check it l'shem Pesach, that's called anishchatim l'shem Pesach, is psulim, it's a psul begufo. Mishum haki, now we understand the brisa that yisaref miyad. ubipture. And this brisa, with regard to the issue that divided Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua about Torah b'dvar mitzvah, is bipture. And savalei ki Rabbi Yeshua. Pture means that you're parted from a chatos because you were told b'dvar mitzvah. So therefore, the Mishnah says that if you shechted on Shabbos, you're patur, you were told b'dvar mitzvah. And the brisa elaborates on the Mishnah and adds that if it happened on Chol, yisarif miyad. And why is that? Because we're going like Yosef, and the carbon is pasul begufo, because it's not a case of a carbon that was shechted l'shem Pesach, and it's right, and it's pasul begufo. Now the Gemara offers another answer, possibly to reconcile Rav with the Brisa, with the Tan of the Brisa. Rav Ashi Omar, there's no stira, but rather it's machlokas tanoim. Rav, who says that a carbon asham now could be shechted stam as an ola because mesu bailov, and he holds ein tzarech akira. He reflects the opinion of a Tana in our Mishnah, the Omar. And which Tana is that? And on whose shoulders is Rav, who holds Ein Tzarech Akira standing? Ki Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan broke that a korban Pesach that has no bailim automatically becomes shlomim and it doesn't need Akira. And he disagrees with the Tana of the Brisa, who holds that a korban does not automatically become shlomim unless you're okerit, and you explicitly undermine its shem Pesach. And therefore, if you shechted it without doing an akira, then it is a shchita psula of a korban Pesach, and yitzarf miyad. The Sanya, where is this Rabbi Shmuel ben Oshel Rabbi Yochanan broke Omer when Erev Shabbos, when Erev Pesach is Shabbos, im yesh shehus bayom, if there was a period of time that went by, and he could have clarified later, so this is a period of time from Chatzos until the actual Zman Ashchita, and he could have checked out in Moshku Bailim Es Yidei Moshe Meso Shenitmu. In other words, according to Rabbi Shmuel, he should, and he's responsible to check out before he does the Shchita, to make sure that it is Roy Le Karban Pesach, and he didn't ask, he didn't investigate, then he's not called a Toa B'dvar Mitzvah, he's a Shogeg, and he's Chayav Achatos, and if it's Chol, is to ubar to raso v'yotze lebeis asreifa. And again, why is it to ubar to raso? And the answer is because Rabbi Shmuel holds that ein tzarech akira, and therefore it automatically became a korban shlomim, and it's not a psul begufo as we discussed, and therefore to ubar to raso. My timer. So Rav Ashi asks the rhetorical question, why does Rabbi Shmuel say that the korban is not burnt immediately, but rather we have to wait till to burn? So Lav Mishum, isn't it because the lo boy akira? And if there's no bailim and there's no ochlim, etc., it becomes shlomim by itself automatically. And when he checks in on Erev Pesach in the afternoon, it's not a psul begufo, but rather machmas dover acher because of the undermining the Talmid shel Bein Ramah. So Gemara rejects this. Mimai, how do you know that Rabbi Shmuel holds that ein tzarech akira dilma? Perhaps even Rabbi Shmuel agrees that tzarech akira, therefore the Pesach has no bailim, then it still remains a Pesach until you're oker shmo. And if he shechts it l'shem Pesach, it's called a psul begufa because there's no money on the Pesach. And now the explanation of the reasoning of Rabbi Yeshua, who says, of Rabbi Shmuel, who says that we don't burn the korban immediately, but rather we wait till Ibur Tzura, Mishum de Savrala, Kitana de Bey, Rabba Bar Avud, the Omar Afilu Pigul. If a korban becomes Pigul during one of the Avodos, he had a Machshav of Chutz Lizmano, even such a korban that's clearly 1,000% is possible, Gufo Nami Boy Ibur Tzura. Even such a psul begufo requires Ibur Tzura. That's the shita of Tana Debei Rab. And how does he derive such a conclusion, a revolution of sorts? And the answer is a gzeir shava. Yoliv avon mi nosar. And we have a Gzerah between Pigul and Nosar. And just like in the case of Nosar, where the Torah says, V'yochlav havono yisa, and we take the word avono in the parsha of Nosar, and we compare it to the word avona in the parsha of of Pigul, v'nefesh ochels meno avona tisa, and just like Nosar is yotel beis hasreifa, the Torah says that you should burn it, but only after ibur tzura. And there's a long discussion here as to how we know that in the case of Nosar, we have to wait till after ibur tzura. And the probable answer is that that exactly is Nosar. Nosar is after ibur tzura by definition. It's therefore Pigul can only be burnt like Nosar can only be burnt after it's Nosar, after it's already ibur tzura. And Rabbi Shmuel accepts that Tana, the opinion of this Tana Debei Rabbah, that a carbon is possible, even if it's possible with gufo, we have to wait until tiaber tzura. We still have to treat the carbon with a certain element of respect and not to be mavazed by immediately burning it. So therefore, Pesach that was shechted, and now we find out that it was moshku bailam yudeim, nitmu or mesu. We have to wait until tiaber tzura, and only then do we burn the carbon. And now the Gemara wants to prove that Rabbi Shmuel is based on this principle of the Tana of Rabbah, that even if it's possible gufo, nevertheless, you have to wait until ibur tzura. To ilo tema, if you don't agree with that, if you're going to say that the reason for Rabbi Shmuel is because a carbon does not need akira, in other words, when the bali carbon mashku yedeim, etc., they died, all the other cases, it becomes shlomim elav, if you're going to assume that, and ein tzarech akira, the psul is only dover acher, and therefore you don't burn it immediately. But in a case of nitmu bailim, let's say, for example, the bailim contracted tumah, and now in such a case, ma'ikal meimar, you cannot say that it became a carbon shlamim, because if the bailim became tmeim, the Torah commands us to bring this very same carbon a month down the line for Pesach Sheni. So how are you going to explain Rabbi Shmuel in the case of nitmu bailim, which is one of the cases where it's ibur tzura, Havadi boy akira? Certainly you need an akira in this case. You have to be oker the shem Pesach in order to consider it shlomim. As we saw before, the Omar Rabbi Chia Bar Gamliel Nizkar B'Achabura Kagon Shayu Bailim Tvei Mesim V'Nidchulu Pesach Sheni. Now, since Rabbi Shmuel said a general rule that in all cases, whether it's Moshku Bailim Yodom, whether it's Mesu, or whether it's Nitma'u, it sounds like it's all one din in all these cases. And whether the carbon is possible gufa, like for example, Nitmu, or midavar acher, let's say moshku yudemo mesu, it's always going to be to ubar tzura kodem sreifa. And why would it be tuna sreifa? It must be that he learned like the Tana of Rabbah, the Gzeir Shava Avon Avon Binosar, that even a carbon that's psula begufo, nevertheless we have to wait until it's ibur tzura. And the time, therefore, the underlying reasoning of Rabbi Shmuel is not because ein tzarech akira, because in a case of nitmu bailim, for sure you need an akira, so it can't be based on ein tzarech akira. So therefore, we reject the answer of Rav Ashi and Ela Machvarta Kedishani Meikara that Yosef ben Chonoihi, and the reason is that the carbon automatically becomes shlomim; it doesn't need an akira. And that reflects the sheet of Rav. And when he shechted l'shem Pesach, it becomes a shlomim that he shechted l'shem Pesach, and therefore it's psul begufo, and therefore you sarif miyad, and you don't wait for ibur tzur. Hadron Alecha Perek elu dvar. Mir Hashem, tomorrow we begin the 7th parak of Pesachim, parak Ketzad Solin. And get your little stoves together for roasting the Korban Pesach, because we're going to learn a lot about roasting the Korban Pesach. Thank you so much.